I want different features in my car than my wife wants, maybe than my best friend wants. My friend drives one brand of vehicle, I drive a different brand of vehicle. We both think we drive the best brand. The reality is that when we go out to dinner this weekend, we're both going to arrive on time and probably safely in our chosen mode of transportation. Whether you're using ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, Gemini, Claude, any of them are better than none and can help you make massive productivity leaps.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Jonathan Mast.
Welcome back to the Startup Podcast. We are living in an absolutely fascinating time. Large language models are arguably the most powerful new technology to hit the world since the internet. Some would say ever. But unlike some technologies, LLMs and AI are both immediately accessible and useful to everyone, and at the same time shrouded in mystery. What are they capable of? How do we get the most out of them? Well, it starts with the art of prompting. And in today's episode, we're going to dive deep on that topic with the absolute perfect guest. Jonathan Mast has been thinking about and working with AI for longer than, well, probably for longer than some of you have been alive. As an experienced entrepreneur and AI educator, he has a sort of deep expertise that is just what the world needs right now. Jonathan has been on a mission to help more people unlock the value of AI through his Facebook community that reaches over 500,000 people, as well as his consulting group, White Deer Technologies. And he is, of course, the inventor of the perfect prompting framework, all of which makes him the absolute perfect person to join me today to talk about the art of prompting and how founders can get the most out of AI. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to converse today.
Listen up. I know a lot of you use dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of those agencies suck. I've been looking for one I can really endorse, and I finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have 100+ experts who don't just code, they solve business problems. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com, that's WARP development.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. Where I thought we would start is, tell me, what do you feel that most people get wrong or don't understand about how to prompt AI models and AI tools?
Well, I think most people overthink it, and they think that you need to be a programmer or that the exact words that you use matter more than they do. I'm not going to say the exact words don't ever matter, but these are large language models, like you said, they're trained on natural language processing. And I find, candidly, they give us the best results when we simply try to have a conversation with them, much like you and I would have here. And I think the biggest mistake people make is simply overcomplicating and overthinking that instead of just diving in and trying to use AI to help handle some everyday tasks.
If that's the case, I think a lot of people get nearly a type of writer's block. It's that blinking cursor with nothing after it. How do I start? So, I don't know, Jonathan, like one thing that I see when I talk to a lot of people is that they get this sense of nearly FOMO, you could call it, with AI, right? They hear everyone around them talking about what a powerful tool it is, how they're getting 5x productivity speed ups from it. And here I am sitting there, not really knowing where to start, feeling I'm not getting much value out of it. It actually causes people a lot of anxiety. So if someone's listening and finds themselves in that situation where they're like, where do I start? How do I start unlocking the value? What would you suggest?
I think the first thing I'd suggest is that you're not alone. AI overwhelm is an absolute real thing. It happens. It even happens to those of us in the industry because things are changing so incredibly fast. But I want to give you permission to not worry about how fast things are changing and not worry about being perfect, because one of the great things about AI is that you can use any model that you have available to you to leap ahead of where you are right now. So even if you did AI poorly, you'd still be able to achieve some massive productivity gains over not using AI at all. And so when you're getting started especially, I want to give you that permission to not be perfect, because you don't need to be. You just need to try. I think of toddlers very often when they do this. When we're born, obviously we can't even roll over, and then we get to the point we can roll over, and then we can crawl, and then we find some furniture and we pull ourselves up, and we take a step and we fall, and we take a step and we fall. But we never give up because we see these adults running around and we want to do that same thing. And AI usage to me is very similar. We need to start by taking those baby steps, no pun intended, to start to learn how to use it. And what I find is that when you do that, when you pick a simple task and have AI help you, you get a win. It boosts your confidence, and then you can do something else. And over the course of a week or two, if you do that regularly, all of a sudden you'll start thinking of new ways to use AI that you hadn't thought of before. And it doesn't mean you're slow or anything else. I've been using AI for a number of years, and I still think of new ways to use it almost every day.
I agree with all of that really strongly. And I think there are a couple of things I wanted to dial into there, and I guess also share some of my personal experience, which is, first of all, yes, just get started, right? Just try using it for certain things. For me, part of the mental block is because of the chat interface, because it's a sort of nearly anthropomorphized thing, right? Where sort of it feels like we're talking to a person. One of the things I've seen and even sometimes experienced is a kind of embarrassment or shyness, right? Which is like, I don't want to ask a stupid question, or I don't want to say something stupid, or I'm a bit nervous about the result I'll get. And so I think it is actually important to remember you're talking to a machine. First of all, there are no stupid questions, but especially the machine really does not care. So by far the quickest way to learn, I'd written here something about a theory of mind for LLMs, and maybe we can come back to that a little bit, because they're like a human, but they're also not like a human. So the best way to learn what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they can do for you is just to keep trying, and then you start to build that instinct. Another thing that maybe, and we'll definitely come back to this, but maybe some people feel alongside or instead of that anxiety is nearly what you say is sort of cynicism, Jonathan, where people say, well, LLMs is just lots of hype. I tried a few prompts and the results were shit, so LLMs are not any good.
I've heard that I don't know how many times, yeah. And, my challenge would be is the first time you've done almost anything in life, it was probably shit. And that's okay. AI is no different. We need to learn how to do it. I'll think back to the first time I asked a girl out on a date. I did a really rotten job of it because I didn't have any experience doing it.
And now?
I got better. The first time I drove a vehicle, first time I tried to ride a bike, I did a rotten job in each of those cases. And it's not so much on you, but part of it is because it's how we're asking the AI to do things for us that does matter. I think where we fall apart is if we're having a conversation between you and I, it's pretty simple. If you're an expert at writing press releases and I need a press release written, I'm going to come up to you and I'm not just going to say, write me a press release and turn around and walk away. But that is what we tend to do with AI. We tend to walk up and say, create a social media post, write me an email, make a memo, create an SOP, and we don't give it any context. And then it produces something that's really pretty rotten overall. And we're like, see, I knew it. This AI stuff just sucks. When in reality, we simply didn't give it a chance to succeed any more than I would give you a chance to succeed if I just said, write me a press release and I turned around and didn't give you any more information.
Which I think leads us perfectly to talk about what is the basic structure and some of the things to think about to write the perfect prompt. So, okay, write me a press release is not a good prompt. So what would a good prompt look like?
Well, I believe in taking 4 steps and following a 4-step framework. We call it the perfect prompt framework in order to do that. And it's very straightforward and simple. Step 1, tell the AI the type of expert that it is. Number 2, give it context. Like anything else in life, we need context in order to be able to do a good job. And then step 3, ask it our question. That's what most of us do. We stop right there. We literally just ask it our question and we stop at that point in time. Step 4 to me is the most important. So we've told it what type of expert, we've given it context, and we've asked our question. But chances are, if you're anything like me, I don't necessarily know all of the information that I should give it in order to get the right response. It's like if I ask you to write a press release, I don't really know what information you need because I'm not an expert at that. So I need to let you ask me questions, and we need to end it with step 4, just literally adding this phrase to the end of your prompt, which is ask me any questions you have. And when we do that, you're giving permission to the model to now not follow its programming, which is to fill in the blanks and assume, but to ask you questions, because the model's smart enough to know, you asked me to write a press release, I need these 5 pieces of information, and you only gave me 2, Jonathan, so it'll ask me the other 3. And that will allow me to answer and give it a much, much better response.
So let's maybe actually go through those 4 steps, each in a little bit of more detail. So the first step is to tell them what sort of expert they are. Why is this important? And what might that look like?
We have to understand that AI has been trained essentially on every book in every library around the world on all kinds of additional data. And much like as you could imagine walking into the world's largest library that was, hundreds of stories tall and literally bigger than any IKEA store you've ever been in your life. You need to find one book. You need a map, or you're going to be there for years trying to find that one book. And AI, while it's much faster than we'd be at finding a book, has so much information that when we direct it and tell it what type of expert it's supposed to be, it immediately can go zero in on the book or the books or the knowledge that we need it to access. And that allows it to give us a more refined and a more specific response.
So a large language model, in a sense, contains multitudes. And this definitely comes back to this theory of mind. Like, one of the things that you see is that as a person interacting with an AI, you assume it is like a person. And in a lot of ways it is, right? Because it is designed to simulate the way a person reasons. But a single large language model is not just a particular person, or it's not simulating a particular person. It's nearly like a whole lot of different people. It's got multiple personalities, multiple sets of expertise in there. And so if you just talk to the LLM without telling it what it is, you kind of get an averaged out generic version of that person.
Yes.
But accessible in there, you're saying, okay, when you say you are an expert at public relations, you are telling it which of the people inside it you want to talk to, in a sense.
Exactly.
And
I love that.
That, activates different parts of the neural network and gives you specific results that you want.
No, I love the way you put that. I think that's so accurate. You're basically telling which of your multiple personalities do I want to speak with at this point? And it works so incredibly well.
The next thing is context, which is simultaneously, I think, the most obvious part of this, Jonathan, and also the thing that people seem to fail at the most. Tell me about that, and what does it look like to give an AI good context as part of the prompt?
Well, this is the area where I think most people tend to overcomplicate their prompts. Give it the information that you know you should, and that you feel that you should, but don't worry about giving it everything. In other words, this is not a time for you to stress and worry that, I'm not sure what information to give it. Because of step 4, we want to give it everything we can to help set the context and help set the parameters, but we've got a fail safe. So you just want to give it what you believe that would be applicable. Just like if I was asking you to write a press release, I might say, hey, it's for this audience and I want it to achieve the following. There's probably 6 more things you need to know, but at least that gives you some context to draw in to what I'm looking for. And so I think that's really the important part of context.
Yeah, well, I guess there's 2 types of context, right? There's sort of the broad context, the true context, which is like, this is the type of company we are, this is our tone of voice, this is the industry landscape, and so on. And then there's the narrow context, you could nearly call it the text, right? Which is like, if you wanted to write a press release about a certain thing, communicating a certain message, you better tell it what that message is. A mistake that I've made quite often is said, write me a LinkedIn post on this topic or whatever. Not that I use AI to draft any of my LinkedIn posts, folks, but I've asked it to do that because I have an opinion on that topic, right? But I haven't told it my opinion. So
Thank you.
It can't guess, right? It can't guess what you want it to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. We, like you said, we asked it to do something for us, but we didn't tell it what we wanted the outcome to be or the position that we wanted it to take. And therefore, it may or may not know and may totally miss the mark. So I find that a lot when I'm doing it. And I readily admit I do use AI to help with my social posts. I've still got the idea. I'm still doing the final refinement, but I use it to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And if we don't tell it the position we want it to take, the tone that we want, it's not going to likely guess that and get it right.
And neither would a person. So this is one where an LLM is a lot like a human, right? And this to me is nearly like a leadership or a communication skill that is very similar between working with other people and working with AI. If you've got an intern or a junior employee and you say, go write me a press release, they'll also not do a good job, right? Because you haven't told them what to do. You haven't given them adequate guidance. So nearly, maybe, Jonathan, I'm sorry to sort of break your framework a little bit, but I think when you talk about context, there's 2 types of context here, right? There is true context, and maybe you could call it guidance, right? Like, what do I actually want you to do? And I think that's really important.
I don't really consider that breaking the framework. Part of the framework is designed to help make AI approachable. And so obviously there's a lot of add-ons that we can put into that framework to make it even better. But my goal there was to come up with something that was simple and applicable for the average person that wasn't overwhelming. Somebody in my group recently posted a 27-step prompt framework.
Oh, God, no.
And it's a better prompt framework than I did. But the problem is it's 27 steps. And therefore, the average human being is going to look at that and go, oh, never mind, that's more work. I wanted something that was very approachable and very effective. That got us 90% of the way there in 4 simple steps.
Well, another thing, and maybe we can come back to this, Jonathan, is that there are different levels of prompting for different use cases, right? I think there's sort of the interactive use case and the stored use case, because, if you're building a piece of software that uses AI, or, if you want to provide some instructions to a system, and then maybe a 27-step prompt framework. I've done this, right? I've put a lot of effort into crafting a prompt that will be used over and over again. But when I'm in an interactive session, I have a ChatGPT window open, I'm not doing a 27-step prompt. That's overwhelming. And so all of these things actually kind of dovetail together in interesting ways. And perhaps we can come back to that. Step 3, the question. So what does that look like?
It's the simple part. It's whatever you were going to ask AI in the first place. It's the write me the press release, create the SOP. Often it's 3 to 5 words. It's whatever it was that we were going to ask it to do in the first place.
And then step 4 is encourage it to ask you questions to fill in the information gaps it has from the initial prompt. Now, why is this so important, and why is it necessary?
Well, the main reasons it's necessary is that AI has been programmed to not ask questions, but to make assumptions.
Why is that, do you think?
I think it's very simple economics. They want us to use the AI model, and they know that as human beings, if they frustrate us and they ask us to do too many things, we're not going to use it. So they have to make it as easy as possible. It's kind of like if you've ever had a 3-year-old in your house. They walk around and the constant question they have for everything is, why? Why? After a while, we just, and I please not hear why when I say to do something.
I'm going for a walk.
Yeah, exactly. And so they've trained the AI to fill in the blanks, to ask assumptions, I believe, because they're desirous of us to use it more and they want to make it less annoying. The reality for many business people, at least, is the fact that by doing that, they've actually made it more annoying in some respects because it just misses the mark totally in some aspects. So that's why I think it's so important that we tell it, ask me any questions you have, and we give it that permission to do so.
I've been doing this for a little while now, and the results are amazing. And I think you're right that people, it's more annoying, but it's even worse than that. I was talking about the cynics or the skeptics who say, oh, well, I tried using an LLM and it's shit. Or they'll point to these articles about hallucinations, which is where the LLM makes up facts, which is something that is, in a sense, innate to the technology. It doesn't know how to say, I don't know. So if you don't give it all the information, then it is more likely to hallucinate. Whereas what it does seem to be quite capable of is if it doesn't know and you give it permission to ask you questions, then it is actually much less likely to hallucinate. That's what I've noticed, right? Because it gets to ask, and it's shockingly good at it. This is why it feels like we're in a bit of an age of wonders. People tend to underestimate these large language models more than they overestimate them. And the ability for you to give it a prompt and for it to look at that and say, okay, here are the gaps that you need to fill so that I can produce a good result, better than most humans can do it, right? It'll come back with really targeted questions. I can answer them, and I feel a lot more confident with the result after that. So folks, yes, I don't know. Oh, maybe, you said, Jonathan, maybe why they're not programmed to do this out of the box, but it is such an easy and important, if you call it a hack, it's not a hack, right? It's a core part of the technique. Always encourage it to ask you a question. And again, as someone who has managed teams of people, led teams of people for a long time, that's always been my approach as a leader, right? If you have a bunch of junior employees who are perhaps, not super confident, and you give them an instruction, then they'll go off and do it wrong. But if you say, hey, look, I really want to be accessible. If you have any questions, my expectation of you is that you ask them to me so that you don't make mistakes. And it's the same with the LLM. Think about the LLM as, maybe this is not the most politically correct thing to say, but that it's your servant, right? You have a lot of power over it. It doesn't feel empowered to challenge you.
Yes.
Unless you explicitly give it permission. That is how it's programmed.
No, I actually think that's a really good analogy. And, you're absolutely right. It doesn't feel like it's empowered to do that because of the way it's been programmed. And we can do that. And it then ultimately saves us a lot of time and energy because we're getting better responses out of it.
Exactly right. So anyway, that's the core of it, Jonathan. And the next thing, though, is LLMs, they certainly aren't perfect, and they're as good as humans, better than humans at a lot of things. There are also things they are worse at than humans. And so if I'm not getting the results I want, I think the key question I often ask myself is it the model or is it me? Is it my prompt? How do you explore the edges of what these things are capable of? And when do you know when you've simply hit the limits?
It's a good question. I would say in general, when I'm not getting what I want, it's probably because of me. Garbage in, garbage out, if I'm not prompting it right. Now, there are absolutely exceptions to that, though. Sometimes it seems to me that, ChatGPT or any model I'm using simply has decided to check out for the day. Like it's gotten dumb. It's having a bad day, where I can try prompts that I've used before, or similar type prompts, and it gets very bad responses. I find that much like any technology, one of the best things to do when that's happening, if you're not getting the response you want out of it, go ahead and start a new conversation. In other words, sometimes just by rebooting, which isn't, you're not really rebooting, but by starting a new conversation from scratch, it resets something on the AI model and you start getting much better responses out of that. So again, it's probably the old 80-20 rule. 80% of the time, it's probably us and the way that we're prompting it. 20% of the time, it's the model. But at the end of the day, I think most models are not hugely divergent in their capabilities, despite what their marketing departments tell us. Most of the models are relatively close for the average user. Power users may find certain models that work better or others. I love to use Claude when I'm writing copy because I think it does a better job than ChatGPT, but not enough of a better job for most people that it would matter. It just happens to be because I write a lot of marketing copy. If I didn't, it probably wouldn't matter in the least. So I think it really depends on your use cases and how you're using things.
I keep coming back to this theory of mind, right? To understand how LLMs are trained and what they do, right? Because, you don't need to go deep into the technical details to understand some of this and to maybe be able to make some inferences, right? So LLMs are trained on vast quantities of human-generated data, increasingly synthetic data as well, but we'll put that to one side. And so what that means is that they are very good at anything that is deductive, inferential, right? Where you sort of say, hey, analyze this thing. It's a brilliant critic. It's a brilliant teacher, right? Because this is about taking stuff that it already knows and applying it. And it's also obviously better at things that it's seen a lot of training data for. One of the reasons that AI is very good at coding is because there's a huge amount of code in its training data. There are other reasons too, right? But it's also going to be better in English than it's going to be in Macedonian, unfortunately, because it's had more training data in English. And so, I think those are the things that are sort of worth bearing in mind when you wonder, what are the limits of its capabilities? I think it also means that, that more creative tasks, it is going to be a little bit less good at, right? It's less good at inductive thinking like that. Now, you mentioned writing copy, right? So it can do things that are sort of creativity adjacent, right?
Yes, I like that. That's a great phrase.
But the true spark needs to come from you. It can write good copy if you know what you want it to write and you instruct it. It can do good brainstorming because quite often brainstorming really is about making a bunch of connections between things that are already there. So I wouldn't say that AI is not capable of doing creative tasks, but think about how does the existing corpus of human knowledge apply to this existing task? And the more that it really is based on what's come before, the more capable the AI model is going to be at addressing that. So you mentioned using Claude for copy. So one of the other things I wanted to get into, and this kind of deals with the AI overwhelm question as well. You go back just 3 years and there was one model. You went to ChatGPT, you got GPT-3, and it did what it did. Now, I think it can induce a lot of anxiety in what model to use. In fact, until a couple of weeks ago, I think OpenAI had a drop-down with 8 different models you could use just in ChatGPT. So, we've got OpenAI versus Anthropic's Claude models versus Google's Gemini models, and then, a whole bunch of other smaller players. Within that, you've got the so-called reasoning models versus the vanilla, the non-reasoning models. You've got specially tuned models. So again, if I'm sitting here going, I don't know a lot about this stuff, where do I start? It feels like a lot of overwhelm. And then, once you have started and you want to get a bit more advanced and you want to keep up with which tools are best for me, I feel a bit of overwhelm as well, which is, okay, I have a task. Who do I give it to? So how do you approach that, Jonathan?
To begin with, I recommend that whatever AI model you have available to you today is likely the best model for you at this time. In other words, I've met so many people that they spend their entire time looking for the perfect AI model. instead of using the one that they have available to them. And whatever you have available to you is likely going to allow you to take such massive productivity leaps ahead of where you are now that it's worth pursuing that immediately, because the perfect model doesn't exist. And if it does, then with news and updates as fast as they're coming out, it'll be different in 2 days than it is today. Use what you have available to you, and chances are that's going to work super well. What I find is that as we begin to become more proficient at using it, like anything else in life, we then develop some preferences. Same thing can be said of vehicles. I want different features in my car than my wife wants, maybe than my best friend wants. My friend drives one brand of vehicle, I drive a different brand of vehicle. We both think we drive the best brand. The reality is that when we go out to dinner this weekend, we're both going to arrive on time and probably safely in our chosen mode of transportation. And we're both going to think we did it the best. Either one of them, we could have switched and it would have worked. Now, maybe I would have had to figure out where the lights were in his car and vice versa. But whether you're using ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, Gemini, Claude, any of the other ancillary models that you mentioned, any of them are better than none and can help you make massive productivity leaps with any of them that you start with. If you're not sure where to start, I tell everybody start with one of the industry stalwarts, who, if we have such a thing in such a young industry, and that would be OpenAI's ChatGPT. You can't go wrong. It's a great place to start.
It is. And you're right. It's 80-20 again, isn't it? Right. Which is you get so much of the benefits straight out of the box. And if you spend your time in a state of analysis paralysis rather than getting that 80% benefit, you're doing yourself a disservice. One thing that I do when it's a more involved piece of work, when it's something that is high value for me, is I often use multiple models at once, right? So the first step is often just to take a single prompt. I can just copy it into my clipboard, paste it into, all three, Claude, Gemini, and OpenAI ChatGPT, and see which one produces the best result. Even more so, I find, and this is not necessarily just my idea, I've heard this from other folks online, is that actually getting these models to be a bit competitive with each other or to cross-fertilize, take the result to your prompt from Gemini, paste it into Claude, say this is what Gemini produced, can you improve on it, is actually really interesting, because then you're getting the slightly different perspectives, for want of a better term, of those different models. And so, this is something that you can do that is relatively easy, takes just a little bit more time. Like at the very least, just pasting it into 3 models and seeing which result you like the most is really useful.
I think your tip that, feeding data from one model into another can often, like you said, yield even better results. I think that's a great tip.
I listened to a podcast where the host actually said that he explicitly pitted the models against each other, where he would paste the result from Gemini into Claude and say, this is what Gemini produced. It's better than what you produced. And I know you can do better. You're supposed to be a better model for writing and sort of getting the model's competitive juices flowing. And of course, the fascinating thing, Jonathan, about all of these models is because they are trained to respond like humans. They are trained on the corpus of human data. There's this philosophical question of whether they can actually think or not. I think that's beside the point here, right? The point is they've learned that when a human, for example, has its pride challenged, it will respond in a certain way. And so it too will respond in that way. So it makes sense to me that sometimes berating it, sometimes praising it, sometimes making it competitive, all of these emotional manipulation techniques, you could say, that work on humans, surprisingly often work very well with these models as well.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And again, it makes sense to me as well, because like you said, it's been trained on our data. It's been trained on who we are. And therefore, it would make sense that it would mimic us in some of those ways.
Just before we move on from this topic, I suppose, Jonathan, there is one thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, which is the reasoning models, right? So for a long time, we had these sort of more or less pure LLM models, large language models. But there's been this new generation of reasoning models like the O series, O3 from ChatGPT, and Gemini and Claude also have versions of these. Should this be your default driver? When should you use a reasoning versus a vanilla model?
It's a great question. I actually think we're moving to a point that the reasoning models will be the only models we'll have available. I don't think the vanilla models will probably be around other than through the API for developers and things like that, where they need simple tasks done. Those will be very inexpensive and still very reliable to get repeatable results. And I think that will continue to be on the consumer side. What we're using, though, I believe, and again, I could be wrong, but I believe we're moving to a more logic-based model where there's going to be using the thinking-based models by default, simply because it tends to deliver a slightly better result. As you mentioned, OpenAI or ChatGPT has a ton of different models, so many that they even have a sub-menu now that pops up to tell you here's additional models you could choose from. If you're not sure what to use their base model at whatever time it is that you're listening. As we're recording this, that's 4.0. That could be different. I use O4 Mini for a lot of what I do, but part of the reason I do that is I'm kind of a geek and I really like reading the logic processes that it's going through because it helps me learn about the AI. I find that enjoyable. And again, I'm kind of geeky weird. So that's one of the things I like. If you don't care, just use the base models. The base models are still so incredibly good at what they do that you're getting very marginal increases when you start changing to different models in most cases.
Okay, so that's good feedback. And you talked about using the mini model. One thing that I find interesting is also there's a usability aspect, right? If you're paying a subscription, you have access to the sort of the pro, the advanced models, GPT 4.5, and so on. They are the most powerful, but they're also slower. And then if you use something like Gemini 2.5 Flash, I think is the gold standard for me, or some of these smaller OpenAI models, the responses are so fast that that's a real usability difference, right? If you think of user experience, you end up having a faster conversation. And so actually, part of my advice, again, you're right, Jonathan, 80%, 80-20 rule, 80% of the bang for buck just comes from using the default model. But I'd actually encourage you, if you're doing something simpler, less complex, choose one of the small models, Flash or Mini or whatnot, or Haiku from Claude, because they're much faster. Also, if you're worried about the carbon footprint of your conversation, it has a smaller carbon footprint, uses less computation. And so, yeah, if you're like, hey, I'm just doing something fairly basic, I just want a bit of information about this topic, go to one of these small ones and you'll be like, oh, wow, I don't have to wait. That's really nice.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that, again, for most people, those models work well. Your usability is so important. I was on a training today and I did a live demonstration and I happened to be on one of the thinking models and I was literally like, oh, drat. This is going to now take 35 seconds of dead air while we wait for this to had I just used one of the base models. I would have probably got the same answer, or at least so close it wouldn't have mattered. Like you, I love Gemini 2.5 Flash. It's a relatively new model, and it is super fast and super good, and just gives you great results in a very quick turnaround, and that does help usability.
For me, it's the best one. If you, for example, you're seeking technical information, I'm doing a bunch of coding at the moment. I'm a bit rusty. I'm a former software engineer, I guess. And just asking it questions about that and getting instant responses, it's a really amazing experience. Looking for a tech partner to scale your business? Here's one I can personally endorse, Warp Development. With 22 years of experience and 100 plus experts, they deliver custom software and AI solutions that drive results. Visit warpdevelopment.com and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. Okay, so I wanted to talk a bit about memory. This sort of falls into the general space of context, I suppose, but foundation chatbots like ChatGPT are increasingly building a personalized memory of you and your preferences and your past conversations. In addition to that, they also have these sort of default prompts. You can give it instructions that they apply to every conversation you have with them. So it's a fairly broad question. One is how to make the most of it, but also what does it mean for how we select and use LLMs in our work in the future?
I think, memory is being used in order to help make the models easier to use for the users. But I also think there's downsides to that. I do a lot of client work, for example, and I admit I turn memory off on virtually all of my devices. I also find it interesting that ChatGPT is one of the few models that's really promoting the fact that it has memory when we've got all these other models out there. And for the most part, they're certainly not promoting the fact that they're memorizing what you're doing and creating these data files on what we've got. Some are and some are not. I think as we move forward, I think memory is going to probably be something that becomes a much larger issue, primarily because I believe that in order for it to really be effective, it needs to be managed. In other words, memory is limited. We run into that in ChatGPT right now, and it does need to be managed because sometimes it's quite arbitrary in what it decides to add to its memory, and some of those memories are just not relevant to that future use. But I do think it's a technology that's going to continue to get better and continue to improve, and I bet if we were to talk 2 years from now, 99% of the users using AI would be using memory and be happy for it because of how much it helped them. In the same way that candidly, we like the fact that Google knows so much about us because when we think about buying something, it shows us an ad for it. Maybe not literally, but almost. And at the end of the day, we may be uncomfortable with it, but we like the convenience. And I think that's why memory will continue to grow in importance.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Probably one of the reasons that OpenAI are promoting the use of memory is because it's actually a form of vendor lock-in, right? Like
It
you said, the
is.
fact that Google knows so much about us makes it harder for us to go to Bing because Bing may not know so much about us. And so if ChatGPT knows a lot about me and then I'm like, I'd like to try Claude, but Claude doesn't know me, then it's just another barrier to leaving that ecosystem. So I think there's definitely a kind of a commercial, competitive aspect to this.
Absolutely agreed.
I do think there is value to memory in the same way as you say, there is in Google knowing a lot about you. But the difference with LLMs, I think, is there is a sort of beginner mode and a more advanced mode, which is not available, has not been available until now, which is the automatic memory is if you're just a regular person using an LLM, it's really great to have that. But if you're a bit more advanced, if you are trying to make the most of these tools, then I don't know what you think about this, Jonathan, but I think about like trying to distill what you want the model to know about you into the default prompt or whatever you call it. I think it's got different names in different places, but you can actually put in quite a lengthy document saying, hi, I'm Yaniv. Or, hi, I'm Jonathan. This is my background. This is what I'm interested in. This is my writing style. These are the topics I like. This is how I like to be spoken to. This is my family background, everything you want. And then you are in control of what it knows. And to your point, Jonathan, it also means you're not wasting space on irrelevant data that is actually not so important, which is just chewing up space in your context window.
Yeah, 100%.
On top of that, that makes it portable because if you have a prompt like that, then you can just take it over to Claude. You can take it over to Gemini or DeepSeek, whatever new model comes, and then it has the memory as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think we're going to see a lot of tools that are going to be coming out that work in conjunction with AI models, browser plugins and things like that, that accomplish a lot of what you're talking about and create that portability. Because I absolutely believe one of the reasons ChatGPT is doing that is for vendor lock-in. It's going to make it that much harder for us to go somewhere else because it's going to give us better responses and going to be easier for us to use. Again, that user experience that you spoke about up front is going to be better based on that memory.
This speaks to this broader trend around context and, these sort of concentric rings of context, Jonathan, right? Where we talk about embedding the context into the prompt, but there's also the context from the memory, the context from the default. And there's this fascinating thing happening, right? Where we're bringing back nearly a culture of writing to get the most out of LLMs. And, this is actually most obvious. Again, I'm a software developer. And if you use these AI tools like Cursor or Windsurf, not the vibe coding ones, the ones that are sort of the assistant IDEs to get the most value out of a complex task, they have these things called rules and, various other things, which are basically written documents with some triggering rules saying, if you're writing a test, read this document, add it to your context. This is how we write tests here and so on. And the irony is it's basically the sort of documentation that you should have been writing for all of your developers anyway, but at most startups, people don't have the time to do it. And it's like, okay, now if we want Cursor to actually improve our productivity by 50%, we need to write all this stuff down. We need to be really explicit. So these coding agents actually are very context heavy. If you want them to work well, you need to provide them a lot of context, not just in your prompt, but also the sort of general context about your project and your coding style and the infrastructure that you're using, and you need to have it written down. Do you see that sort of spreading more into just general use, and how does that affect how people do their work and live their lives even?
I do. I think that we're going to see a lot more of that. It reminds me a lot of a conversation I had about automations. Automations are wonderful, but they're only wonderful when you have a proven and well-documented process. If you try to automate something that's not proven and not well-documented, you end up with a hot mess really quickly. And so I think with AI, I actually think being organized, being able to give it concise and relevant information is going to become even more important as we move forward, especially at the enterprise level where we're going to be using AI to provide services for other people to be able to do things, to help you pick the Netflix movie you want to watch, whatever it is. That speed at which it can do and the ability to do all of that, as you're talking about, I think is going to be very, very important.
Yeah, well, that's actually a perfect segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is embedding good AI practices in your startup. So far, we've really been talking about LLMs and prompting and how to get the most out of them, in a sense, nearly as an individual trying to improve your personal productivity, in a sense. But the audience of this podcast is founders, and we want people to be using AI in their startup to accelerate. And I think you nearly touched on it there with that comment about automation, which is that here we need to be a little bit more thoughtful, right? Because the power is incredible, but it can also be a little bit of a trap, in my view. I'm interested in your thoughts, because you can quickly end up with a very heavily automated system that is very fragile. So if you think about, okay, we're not a large enterprise, right? We're a startup or a scale-up company. And we want people to use LLMs more. We want more automation. We want faster execution. What are some of the things, that sort of the countervailing things nearly, that you want to think of, the structures you want to put in place so that people both get the most out of these things, that they're sharing knowledge, they're sharing capabilities, but also that they have enough guardrails that they don't put themselves into a situation where they just make a hot mess?
I think one of the most important things as we look at developing systems like that is that we understand that simple questions result in repeatable answers or consistent answers. In other words, I don't want to have, as part of my process, I don't want to ask the AI to do 3 things in one step necessarily, because there's a higher likelihood that it's going to error or to diverge at some point in time, as opposed to if I had 3 commands, each asking it to do one thing in sequence. That the more simply we can break down those tasks that we're using, the better. The good news is computers and technology are so fast that 3 tasks executed in sequence versus 1 task with 3 subtasks can both be executed very, very quickly. The user will not see the difference. But as we're developing these systems, it's so important that we look at it from the perspective of we need to be able to create replicatable results. I'll use McDonald's as a great example. They may not have the best hamburger, but they probably make more money than any other restaurant in the world in selling hamburgers. And that's because whether you're in the United States, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in China, whether you're in Australia, if you walk into a McDonald's and you order a Big Mac, you're likely going to get almost the exact same thing every time. And that type of thing becomes important as we're creating larger systems and we're using AI more and more to facilitate things. We've got to be able to create repeatable, reliable results that we get. And in my mind, that means simple instructions that are executed in sequence versus complex instructions executed in batch.
In addition to that, Jonathan, I have a view that I'd be interested in validating with you, which again comes, I guess, from my background as a software developer, which is that when you start using a lot of AI tools for automation and for effectively outsourcing more menial or repeatable tasks within your organization, what you're actually doing, whether you realize it or not, is you are building custom software, right? It becomes part of your organization's operating system. And so, in software engineering, we've learned a lot of hard lessons over the decades about making reliable software. And I think 3 of the key pillars are version control, testing, and documentation. And when I see companies going there saying, we're going to automate everything, we're putting in an AI automation tool and we're just going to let everyone, automate their tasks and it's going to be great, is I think, this is not production grade software. This is dangerous, right? Where it's like, when your business starts to rely on these tools working reliably in a certain way at scale, in a way that evolves over time, then you need these 3 pillars. Version control, so that if you make a mistake, you can go back to the old version. Testing, so you can actually make sure it's still working the way you expect it to. And documentation, so people understand what's there and what it's actually supposed to do. And I think that you can, when you're speed running this transformation, it can be easy for folks, especially without that software dev background, to forget about these things.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I was talking to a group today about just a simple custom GPT inside of ChatGPT and about documenting it as you're creating it as to what steps, what your training documents are and saving them. And one of the people said, well, you can always just delete them down the road. And I said, yeah, but if you don't have the original somewhere and you're not storing revisions and you make a change and something goes wrong, you can't easily revert back to where you were. There isn't an undo feature. So you need to have these things very simple, version controlled and saved so you've got access. But you're right. I don't think most people are used to thinking in those terms. And so there's definitely some surprises ahead for certain people as they begin thinking, as you talked about the places that we're going to automate everything. It's not quite as simple as the marketing departments want us to believe.
That's right. And, to use that example of if you have a GPT, a big part of a GPT, this is, after all, an episode about prompting, is the prompt that GPT has, right? And ChatGPT conveniently provides an editor right in there where you can just sort of type in your prompt. Then you can come in tomorrow and change it a bit. But if after a while you're like, oh, I actually think it worked better last week, how do I go back to how it was then? At least last I checked it, there was no proper version control within the OpenAI tool, which means you need somewhere else where you store your prompt, which is valuable intellectual property that you have developed, so that you can actually control how it evolves over time. You can see what the old versions look like and so on. Obviously, there are proper version control tools like Git, which I think more people should use outside of software development now. But even if not that, even having it like in a Google Doc, at least it maintains a version history, right? So you can go back to old versions. So, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. Make sure you are keeping your versions around.
I love that. Great, 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 great quote.
Just before we move on, anything else about embedding good AI practices in your startup, or sort of things where you're like, this is where I'd start in an organization?
Anytime an organization is looking at starting with AI, I'm a huge proponent of finding those tasks that we need to have done, but that we kind of groan aloud when we have to do them. And like, oh yeah, I know I've got to go through these reports, but I don't want to. I know I've got to balance my checkbook, but I don't want to. Finding things like that and identifying which of those AI may be able to help you shortcut, so to speak, by doing some of that for you. I'm not going to be able to do it in all of them, but you will get some very immediate wins in some of those, because many of those involved consistent task execution, deep research, analytical, data analytics, and things like that, that oftentimes can be well handled by an AI model. Not always, but oftentimes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, there's this good advertising campaign for an accounting tool here, and it says, do more work and less work, right? This is, for example, it's for sole traders. So if you're a plumber, do more plumbing and less invoicing, right? And I think that's actually a really great way of phrasing it. It's like, think about what's all the work. If you're in a startup, there are two types of things you're doing. There are the things that directly add value, building the product, talking to users, and so on. And then there's all the stuff around it, all the guff that just has to be done because it's part of running a business, part of running an organization. Find the work, see if you can get AI to do more and more of that for you. And actually, this is an aside. I don't know if it's something that you've thought about or experienced or so on, is I actually feel that for startup founders, this is also an incredible work-life balance opportunity, because
I agree.
Traditionally, as a founder, there's this concept, which I think has been correct, of just having to grind. If you want to do this thing, you've got to work 80 hours a week because it's so much to do and it's so hard. But it's actually well known that our cognitive capacity for highly engaging, deep work is only probably 4 to 5 hours a day. And then our brain is just exhausted from that sort of work. So if you can automate a lot of that other stuff, the grindy stuff, and focus on just your pure executive function as a founder, doing your highest and best purpose, suddenly you might find that you get a whole bunch of time back in your week. And I find that really exciting as a founder myself.
Well, I found it so true. I mean, I still probably work more hours than I should, but I work far fewer hours than I did 2 years ago because of AI. I have much more time to enjoy life a little bit more, to take a rest here and there. And as you mentioned, one of the things I've learned is that sometimes working fewer hours generates better results. I'm not going to say that means we should all work 2 hours a week, because I don't believe that's enough for most of us to get great work done. But sometimes working 80 hours a week is less productive than working 50 hours a week if we work those 50 hours a week smartly.
Exactly so. Yes, this is not about working 2 hours a day, but it's about working maybe 8 hours a day instead of 12 hours a day. Because frankly, I mean, you're pretty exhausted at the end of 12 hours anyway, right? And, I question whether it's always a useful thing to do. But if you're doing really all the deep thinking, and like prompting LLMs is actually cognitively a lot more taxing than doing those repetitive tasks, then, well, by the end of 8 hours, you're pooped. Also, you've got more done than you used to get done in those 12 hours. So you get to be kind to yourself and say, you know what, I'm out. I've squeezed all the juice out of this brain that I can today.
Well, that's actually one of the things I'm really excited about AI is giving us that opportunity to pursue things that maybe we've gotten too busy to pursue. I know people talk about, oh, this is going to destroy creativity. And in my mind, it isn't, because even in my life, I've seen it's given me more capacity to be creative because I now have time to do things because I'm not constantly focused on trying to get caught up on things. AI lets me stay far enough ahead. So I believe that it's going to really create some amazing opportunities for us just to, as you pointed, live a better life, to live a more fulfilled life that fits our goals and our objectives.
So we're on the home stretch now. I thought one thing I would just be curious about is, do you have any fun but also valuable AI hacks or Easter eggs, things that you say to it, certain like prompting tricks or turns of phrase that you find sometimes unlock extra powers that you wouldn't otherwise get?
One of my favorites is just to use a phrase called Hemingway rules. And literally, when I'm creating things, AI has a tendency sometimes to get a bit more verbose than I want it to be, and certainly more detailed than sometimes my ADD brain wants to deal with. And I find if I simply go back and say, rewrite using Hemingway rules, that simple little 4 words will allow it to simplify everything it's done, not without losing the context, without losing the value, to simplify that. And it's super fast, it's super easy. And I find in most cases, it improves the communication I'm trying to do, because let's face it, most of us don't want to read more than necessary either. And I find that just does a great job of keeping things focused and getting great results along the way.
Yeah, I love that. My version of that is less cringe. So it'll write something and I'll say, do it the same, but less cringe. And strangely, it understands. It's like, okay, here it is. It's just way better and way less cringy. You know, the other thing for me is like, sometimes you just get it and you say, you can do better than that, which, you know, actually breaks part of the rules of the perfect prompting framework, because we're not giving it any useful context there. And yet somehow it often can do better than that. And it proves
Well, and in a way, the perfect prompt is really designed for that first prompt more than it is anything else. From there on, conversations are great. You know, I mean, if I give it something and follow my perfect prompt framework and I don't like the results, I love it. You know, try again with less cringe is a perfect prompt to follow up on, because it already has all that original context. We don't need to restate that every time, if that makes any sense.
Exactly. So, you know, I think maybe to make it even more, like, it might seem obvious to us, but to be more explicit about it, right? You know, you talked about ending your initial prompt with a question, and that generates an interaction. But I think people maybe from Google search and so on are used to sort of one-shotting things, right? Where they're like, you put in a prompt, you get the result. And then if you're like, oh, it's no good, LLMs suck. But actually it's this back and forth, right? When I'm using an LLM, you get multiple iterations and rounds, and you give it feedback, and it's incredibly good at incorporating that feedback. So whatever task it is that you are asking the LLM to do, think of it as, I think you used the word a session, right? It's an interactive conversation, discussion, where you're not expecting the perfect result the first time.
Absolutely. I often say, you know, using AI is not like using a slot machine. It's not pulling the lever and hoping we get the perfect result, because it's like conversing with humans. It's often a conversation, not a statement and a response.
Yeah. It's a journey you go on together, really, isn't it? Like, you know, I think people have different ways of communication. I know that a lot of the time I think through conversation, right? I only know what I want, or, you know, I get new insights from having a conversation with someone. It's one of the reasons I love doing this podcast, because quite often I learn new things about myself or what I think, or I come up with new ideas simply by having a conversation with someone, as well as, of course, learning from them. And I think I find that as well in a conversation with an LLM, is it's only by going back and forth that I realize what I really wanted in the first place. And so don't deny yourself that opportunity. Well, finally, Jonathan, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what you see the future of human AI interaction looking like. Put on your futurist hat. The future is bright, so maybe you're already wearing the futurist hat. What does it look like in 5 years?
I'm pretty sure I don't know what I don't know, but I think a couple things will likely be true. One is I think we're going to have a lot more AI-based appliances than we do now. In other words, things that we use on a regular basis that make it easier for us to interact with AI, whether that be things like Ray-Ban sunglasses or, you know, the Claude pendant that we wear around our neck that can communicate with us. I think AI is going to be something that's much more just autonomous in our lives. It's going to be there. It's going to be something that we use on a more consistent basis. I think that we're also going to find as we move on that one of the best uses for AI is not just going to be in doing tasks for us, but is going to be in helping us learn. And one of the things I'm most excited about that I see happening, and I really believe is going to be monumental, is that, now when any of us go to take a class, we learn in one way because the instructor's teaching one way to all of us, whether that be grade school, whether that be high school, whether that be university, it doesn't really matter. Imagine now the ability that when a student, whether they be young, old, or wherever, sitting in a classroom, here's a topic, maybe it's learning algebra, and now that's taught by the instructor, by the teacher, but immediately it's now relayed to the user, to the individual student in a manner and a context that they care about. I happen to love motorcycles, so maybe when I'm learning geometry, it brings geometry and talks about motorcycles and gears and things like that have different angles so that I become interested in learning geometry. And yet, if I had a sister, I don't. My sister might be more interested in gardening. And so maybe it then uses gardening to talk about geometry, and it teaches geometry through those same contexts. We're going to have the ability for that to happen virtually instantaneously. And I think it's going to increase our ability to learn, and it's going to really democratize learning. In other words, it will no longer matter, and I don't know how it is in your section of the world, but where I'm at, it matters where you live as to the quality of school that you get.
I think that's the same in most places. Absolutely.
I love the idea that that will change, because if we have access, I'm looking for my phone. If we have access to one of these, we're going to have the ability to really learn anything we want to in the context that we want, that it resonates with us. And I'm probably most excited for that over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and kind of break it down into two things, right? I think for the motivated learner, just having something like ChatGPT is already incredible. It's something that Google used to be good at, and then ChatGPT just dials it up by another 10x, right? Where it's like, I want to learn about something. I have a bunch of questions, and I ask the questions. I get the answers. That raises new questions. I ask those questions, and I get customized responses. And, I can also say, or the memory sometimes does it for me. I say, look, this is what I am. I used to be quite, I was a software engineer. I've not been doing it for about 8 years, so I'm quite rusty. I have the fundamentals, but I don't know the syntax, so teach me at that level. And it's like, perfect, right? And I'm like, I like learning by analogy. Every time when you explain a concept to me, give me an example. It does that. Incredible for motivated learners. Now, when you go into schools and talk about educating everybody, I think it is more complex and probably needs more product work, to your point. Like, how do we craft learning programs for people? But I think that is definitely something that I'm also very excited about for the future. But the truth is today, and if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably someone who is a motivated learner. If you haven't tried using AI as a teacher for something that you want to know about, you get to ask it all the stupid questions you like, and no one's judging you.
And it never gets frustrated at you.
So it's actually the number one use case that I found in terms of boosting me is just that teacher that is on tap all the time. I think that's a good place to finish. Jonathan, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you on. I've learned so much. I know everyone listening here will too. If people want to connect with you, join your communities, learn more about what you do, where can they find you?
Really simply, you remember my name. It's Jonathan Mast, MAST.com. So jonathanmast.com, or just remember the white bearded AI guy. You can go to Whitebeard Strategies or Google white bearded AI. And I've got a ton of free resources, some paid as well, but we'd love to get you connected and help you and your organization leverage AI.
And you also have this Facebook community that you lead, is that right?
We do, yeah. We've got over 400,000 people in there learning, talking, sharing about AI on a day-to-day basis. It's called AI Prompts for Entrepreneurs, and it's on Facebook.
Okay, well, I recommend you all go there. Thanks again, Jonathan, for your time. It's been a fantastic chat, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Warp Development. I know a lot of you rely on dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of these agencies suck. Ask me how I know. I've been looking for one that I can really endorse, and I have finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have over 100 experts who don't just code, they solve business problems alongside you. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp Development delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com, that's WARP development.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation.